with Jim Grice, Eddie Shooter, Dean Nelson, and Keith Dines.
Oh, that's fine.
And Jeremy representing Dean, sorry.
Yeah. So are we ready?
Go.
Am I live? Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for hanging around here for this last session of the forum. We're excited to present this material to you, and hopefully we'll be able to enlighten a few people with some of our findings. As was indicated, my name is Jim Grice, and I guess somewhat an unlikely candidate to be involved in a project like this. I'm an attorney out of Kansas City. But my good friend here, Eddie Shooter, convinced me that this was something I needed to do, and it has been a very rewarding experience for me. And as you know, Eddie is a member of the advisory board and is co-chair of the committee, and then Dean is also co-chairing the working group. But we're real glad Jeremy could be here as well. I was going to say show up since Dean did, but Jeremy could make it because some of the stuff that eBay's been doing is really exemplary of some of the things that we've focused on in this white paper exercise. Other members of the working committee and the working group include Mark Banks at Deutsche Bank, Gary DeMasi at Google, Keith Dines, of course, at Digital Realty, who's with us today, Dave Hampton at Verizon, Sean James at Microsoft, Mikhail Kafalakis at HP, Ken Kristen, Emerson, Mike Lewis at eBay, Phil Myers at Morgan Stanley, Tom Masaki at NRI, Chris Page at Yahoo, and Dan Spadaro at Goldman Sachs. And we tried to draw upon a pretty wide a group of people that had different business model mandates. I mean, that was kind of the idea, and that's what we have found in the course of this white paper, is that business model plays a tremendous role in how you define what a sustainable data center is and how you pick a site to fit your sustainable model. And so with that, well, here we go. Here's the fancy slide. You see, this over 100 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt, who's been identified as probably one of the founders of some of the environmentalist movement in the United States with the National Park System and so forth, is quoted really focusing on not robbing from the future and waste so as to leave the future without the resources, which is really at the core of a sustainable mission. He was doing this, of course, at a time when the industrialists were really emerging in the Industrial Revolution, and it's taken over 100 years for things to kind of catch hold. And with that as a little bit of a guiding principle and a little bit of backdrop, why don't I, talk about bring it to the future. Sustainability at tipping point. Some of the exercise that went through was do a little secondary research in connection with this white paper with myself and my staff. And when you really talk about mega forces that play heavily across sustainable business decisions across the world: population growth, resource scarcity, an emerging middle class, as well as your ones that are typically raised, which is climate change, global warming, and so forth. And so this is all creating, some 100 years later, after Teddy Roosevelt, heightened awareness, industry mandates. I think the MIT Sloan Management Review did a survey last year that indicated 70% of publicly traded companies have a standing agenda item motivated on sustainability. And of course, we're all seeing that, beyond the data center business. And that's really kind of the point here, is that we've got these trends that are affecting us, and the trends are starting to weigh in a more business context, which is really one of the focuses of our white paper exercise. And with that, I might hand it over to Eddie for just a moment, because Eddie and Dean really were the ones that kind of started this topic out, and then I got recruited to assist. So Eddie?
Well, so first of all, I'd like to thank Jim and his staff for volunteering to do this. They've got well over 200 hours into the effort to put together the paper and as well as the study, and they did that voluntarily. So I think Green Grid and the members and those that are present should recognize the hard work that they did. But I would go on to say, basically what the Advisory Council identified 2 years ago was that there were construction and projects that were already underway, and what they're in the market space, we didn't see a lot of technical depth that was involved in the site selection process, although everybody had their own criteria. And while they talked about it as being very, very scientific in many ways, oftentimes what we discovered is that most of us were going back to the same group of consultants for advice and counsel and placement. And many times we'd find that the layering that they were using to do the identification of those locations would not necessarily take sustainability into account. And so you'd be making a decision if you're constructing a data center that was 10 to 20 years in life cycle, that for your corporation, it could last for 20 years. Well, what we also found out was that colocation providers and colocation customers were making those same decisions. And so oftentimes you'd find that as a colocation customer, you would move into a space, but you wouldn't necessarily move out for about 20 years. And so the decisions that are made around that, whether they be sustainable in nature or whether they be how you orient your risk and mitigation, really don't change. The impacts last for a long time in your business. And so you have to make an educated decision, not one based on chasing after other data centers and where they go, or recommendations at a cocktail party, but really and truly based upon some evidence and some tools for that. We had challenged the Green Grid to consider putting together a tool set, if you remember last year's presentation, or maybe it was 2 years ago, but the presentation that we did where we identified a possible tool and made some practical assessments on how that could be done. But we needed more data to understand what people and organizations thought was important and how to get there. So that's how we basically engaged Jim and asked Jim to participate, because many of us, even if we had done an interview, we wouldn't be able to tell each other what our site selection secrets were. So by bringing a third party in who was neutral to all of us, essentially gave us the capability of communicating that in a secure way, and taking that data, clearing it out, and being able to use it as a useful function for us to go in and to move forward with how we would apply the data that we had collected. So, Jim.
Yeah, and so really we kind of established some goals of the white paper would be to really assess the state of the industry as it approaches this potential collision point with sustainability, and identify the basis for the potential collision, and then ultimately propose tools, as Eddie said, that may assist in managing your way through that. And what I found as kind of that third party kind of coming in here trying to absorb as much of this as possible with these interviews is it's just incredibly complicated. And it's incredibly contemplated to get one size fits all, right? I mean, you may understand your model very well, but that model doesn't fit somebody else. And given the cross-section of the working group members, I was able to get a lot of perspective. And maybe I should back up, because the method that we used here that was proposed by Eddie and Dean was for me to essentially engage in a fact-finding mission or investigative mission here to interview the working committee members. I mean, I just sent out an email and said, everybody, can you be available for an hour plus or minus? Some of the discussions lasted longer, but and some we had to reconvene a couple times to get a whole, and I had a standard questionnaire list that I'd go through with everybody, which was essentially a pretty standard site selection criteria list. It was just a filter. What really matters to you, We prepared a web survey, I will tell you, and we knew this going into it. Web surveys don't get much response, and we didn't get much response either. We did that after we did the interviews as a process by which to validate some of our findings. And so we got some of that, but I'm not here to represent. We've got this massive industry survey. It was a 1% response, like every other web survey. And then there was secondary research. And the secondary research is really more me and my staff just trying to pull together some of this, going back to the goals here, identify the basis for the potential collision. What's really happening here. And from my standpoint, I was coming at this, I'm a business lawyer. My involvement in the data center industry is representing data center owners and tenants relative to leases, incentives, tax policy work, and so forth. And so even though I'm pretty deep in the industry from a standpoint of my involvement as a lawyer, I'm by no means an engineer. And so I'm coming at this from a real, I don't want to say pedestrian point of view, but not a technical point of view. I'm trying to hear what are the business underpinnings about this. And so that was really one of the first steps in the process. But this is indicative, this is hard to read, and it wasn't intended to be a slide to something you could take notes from, but and intentionally I've kind of made it so that it's more of a picture, because I think it does tell a story of what I got from the interviews and what we got from the survey data. You'll see each one of these criteria has two lines. One is the average score on a scale of 1 to 5 from the interview candidates, from the work committee members on their individual interview. Of those that ranked them, I will say there were some folks that because of corporate confidentiality reasons, couldn't rank. But I think this really doesn't tell you a big surprise here. Power and telecom on a scale of 1 to 5 is the most important on a relative basis. Now let me do a little explanation here. 1 to 5, the definition of how we did that, 1 doesn't matter. It doesn't make your grid. Doesn't make your filter. You don't even put it on there. 5 singularly could change the course of a site selection by itself. Number 2 is not likely to change the course in combination with other factors. Number 3 is likely to change the course of your site selection in combination with other factors. And 4 is highly likely to change the course of your site selection in combination with other factors. So if that gives you a little bit of a guideline here, 1 to 5, we tried to standardize every interview with that benchmark and standardize that against the survey. And so like I say, no big surprises. Power and telecom, highly important. Proximity, location, and hazard analysis, almost as important, highly important. Taxes and incentives, in some cases a very material driver to TCO, highly important, or at least more important than the rest. And then we get to the next 2 criteria, carbon and renewable energy, water and sewer, okay? In some cases fairly important, not unimportant by any means, any stretch of the imagination. But when you think about business leaders with P&L responsibility, we had this conversation before we walked in here. Jeremy was talking about, when you get right down to it, even with very proactive environmental goals, you still got to make sure there's enough power there to power your data center. And so like I say, there's no big surprises here, but I think this is kind of indicative of kind of the state of 2000 and, mid to late 2012, right? Because that's the other thing, I think, that there is a perception that sustainability is going to play a bigger role, consistent with this idea that we have an emerging trend that's starting to permeate the industry. So then, back to having a common language. One of the things we try to do is make sure that we establish a common language of what constitutes a sustainable data center. What's the definition? This is where the lawyer in me kind of is almost a fault, right? What is the definition? Do we have a definition? Is it adaptable? Can it work for all situations? And so this is what we came up with, and this represents the collective contribution from everybody on the working committee, and in fact some validation in the survey. Comprehensive business environment. Okay, we're back to the whole notion of TCO really is about costs. That supports a reliable and affordable operation. I will tell you that affordable actually got added in the process because more comments we're talking about. We can't lose sight of the fact it has to be an affordable site. P&L responsibility. That's an operational platform over the life cycle. Well, this is key when we get into some of our additional content here today, because life cycle on a particular business model may be different, long or short, depending upon your asset. That achieves a balance of the resources consumed, the products and revenue produced by the project commitment. And then this was the third prong that got added by the working committee, because there were those on the committee that felt like if we didn't specifically identify environmental goals as part of your balance, that the environmental goals would sneak out the back door, which I thought was an interesting way to word it. The person felt strongly about that. But I think this represents kind of the consensus of the working committee, and it seems to work. It seems to work, and intuitively it may not seem that earth-shattering, but it does seem to characterize and it represents a consensus definition. And so then that got us to the whole notion. I go back to the business operational platform and the life cycle. And Eddie, you may want to comment on this a little bit, but we looked at, we tried to lump or at least categorize the big high-level aggregate categories of the business model risk and the question of control. And the idea is if you own it and build it from ground up, then you get to control all of the factors. So you have maximum control over your destiny, and you can do things at that site, such as on-site renewable power generation development and so forth, that might not be available. They're definitely not available to you in the cloud model. You're going to take what you get. You have the least control there. And then in the colocation model, you have varying degrees of control in the middle. And when you're trying to balance that against a sustainability a goal in an organization, we felt like this was important to understand because, again, it's not one size fits all. Eddie, do you want to comment on that at all?
Well, I think it points out that if you're not going to build, that you lose a little bit of your control over sustainability. So if you have sustainability goals and you're planning not to build your data center, then you're at the mercy of the data center owner in some ways about the selection choices they made and what they negotiated with the utilities and those things. So you might find it necessary to put in contractual obligations if you're trying to meet those sustainability or CSR goals. I think what it also reflects, though, is that they still own a certain level of control over that. So even if you write in the hardest controls you can because you know that you're going to be in place for 20 years, and you put in sustainability targets and they don't meet those, and they're violating SLAs, you still failed to meet your CSR goals, regardless if you're getting paid for it or not. And so it's sort of a challenge that I think you have to recognize that if your company has a strong environmental effort going on and that you have a great focus, that the more you move into the cloud environment or the more that you move into a colocation environment, the less control you're going to have over your sustainability results.
Yeah. And I think, Keith, as we talked about this too in preparing for today, I mean, the colocation model, I think one of your comments was, colocation comes in many different shapes and sizes. Do you have any comments to elaborate on this?
It does. Most people know that there's the wholesale colocation model, which is what Digital Realty does, is in a sense a big box white space. Analogy would be a retail mall versus retail colo, which would be cabinets or cages. And so they're very different models. In a wholesale leasing environment, certain customers have a lot of influence over where they want to be, where they want to locate, and what we would do to provide them their data center space. Mm-hmm. So it's a function of size and the term of commitment. But what happens is that there's a proxy for sustainability. In many cases, it's just energy, because everyone who runs a data center know that after the capital expenditure or the lease payment or the amortization, the biggest expense is power. And so power is often used as a proxy for sustainability. And if it was the only one, all the data centers in the U.S. would be in Grant County, Washington, right? Because that's where the power is 2.5 cents a kW, and it's fairly green, it's hydro-based. But the problem we have is that there's so many political forces influencing what we can define as green and renewable power. Mm-hmm. Where of all of us in this room, I think, except for maybe one or two environmentalists, would say that hydropower is green, it's renewable. But the Sierra Club doesn't really agree with us. So, there's again, a kind of a collision about politically what is green, what is renewable. And we found that most customers have a mandate for green and sustainable facilities, but there's a point where it doesn't make sense for the bottom line. As a co-location provider or a landlord, power to us is typically a pass-through to our customers. The consumption is paid by the customer because we have no control over how they ramp up their service and what capacity they're operating at. But we found that if we're in a proper jurisdiction that has renewable power, has green power, has the right climate, we will attract more customers who have that mandate from the corporate or senior leadership to say, we want to have a green facility. And so, I mean, it's very complicated, but it influences where we develop and how well we lease our facilities.
So this is a critical point because to have it's not a one-size-fits-all. So you have to adapt to the life cycle of the commitment, again, the commitment, the facility commitment, and then back into how you're going to balance those, and that ultimately becomes a sustainable site for your facility. But now to turn attention a little bit here to what were some of the critical factors that came out of some of the interviews and a little bit of the survey data, mostly out of the interview process. And I'll go through this quickly because we have some recommendations that the committee has proposed to the technical committee and the operations committee to consider as part of this white paper, because we have finished our white paper, but it's not been finally approved by the Green Grid process, which is probably about a month away. But approaches to carbon neutrality. Well, some of this probably doesn't come as a big surprise as a result of some of the investigation process, efficiency versus reduction versus offset. Everybody's trying to achieve as much efficiency as possible, which becomes a function of the facility itself. But reduction and offset are other strategies, and offset strategies are not as widely used. What came out of this process is that many folks there is some offset strategies in the sense of direct investment into, say, wind energy or something like that, or a purchase of RECs. But at the end of the day, those tend to be bigger players. And so really efficiency is how most people are trying to reduce their carbon footprint. And in some cases, like in the case of Microsoft announced their shadow carbon program. Others have that started as well. Renewables. This is not a quote per se, but it's paraphrased here, this first point. Sustainable site is one where the grid energy sources are tending toward renewable fuel, and the region has natural potential for green energy development. I would add to that, has the legal framework to allow you to access that development potential, because that is a big impediment to developing green energy in a unilateral fashion. You know, you have to rely upon the utility to do it, and sometimes that's not easy to do. So therefore, very few organizations have current plans to develop on-site renewable energy. I mean, I'll come back, because I'm sure Jeremy has some comments on that, as what eBay is doing with some of their facilities. And they've tackled that issue in Utah. And so then essentially what you end up with here, and again, Jeremy, I'll come back to you on this so I can get through these critical factors and we can reserve our time, you know, balancing carbon with costs. This was a drawing actually that represents, this diagram was put together by our technical contributor and tech writer, Nancy Hyman. And the notion here, and she put some inputs in this to talk about, even in a low cost environment that has high carbon power, you can dial in to a tolerance level to the extent you can break through some of those hurdles of on-site renewable development. And so you can have a blended price, which may be higher because your on-site fuel costs may be higher, but it depends on your goals. Again, right, it's a balance. It's a balance. What are your environmental goals, and how do you create that reliable operational platform that puts you in a position to achieve that balance that's best for your organization, whether it's a long-term life cycle or short. How important is water? Water, of course, came up in the course of the conversation. And I will tell you, this was really, again, kind of the outsider talking to folks and just taking notes and trying to understand it. Water efficiency is viewed as an important factor. But a lot of people, person after person, said it's mostly a design issue from their perspective. Is it water cooled? Is it air? Is it other types of cooling? And gray water, oddly enough, from my investigation process, was not necessarily a high sought out situation. I don't know that that surprised anybody in this room. If it's cheaper and it's convenient, it's good to have, but you're not going to go out of your way. You know, and an example of this, in my own kind of policy practices, we're trying to get some legislation done in one of the states here close to California. And we're trying to get some language in there to create benefits to encourage water utilization facilities as part of your data center, part of the data center package. Policymakers love that, you know. They actually are embracing that particular provision quite readily. And then other factors. I think this is interesting to note. I see Mark Monroe out there had mentioned to me about a year ago. Sometimes it's good to know what really didn't resonate. And I'm a redevelopment lawyer by background. I've been doing redevelopment for 20 years, and adaptive reuse, redevelopment, and brownfield opportunities. You know, I ask everybody about that. It's not that people didn't think it was a good idea. It's just when you're talking about ranking them as a sought out situation, all these things on this list. Good ideas, but I'm not going to go to a site because it's a redevelopment opportunity. If it's a redevelopment opportunity and everything else is good, then in some cases I won't be afraid of that. Some people said we don't want brownfields because they don't want the risk associated with that. I mean, it's a different type of site selection, so it's just interesting, I thought, to know the things that, you know, that would really drive another part of sustainability, but yet the industry, quite frankly, a lot of people in the industry like ground up construction on a cornfield. At least that's what I heard. And how does LEED factor in? LEED, of course, is a construction certification. And so it's really almost misplaced when you're talking about site selection. The only context would be, does the site lend itself to LEED points that get you to a certification? You know, as everybody probably knows, there's 4 levels of LEED through the U.S. Green Building Council. And I know, like digital, Keith, you have some comments about LEED, and there's a new criteria being developed and whatnot, but it's, everybody talked about LEED a lot, to a person. I don't think there was anybody that didn't rank LEED as an important thing, but it wasn't something that really drove site selection. And then tax incentives and framework. They ranked high. The only thing I would comment on this is that incentive programs, in some cases, from my perspective as an incentive lawyer, I kind of got the impression that incentives didn't necessarily, that they're underutilized. There's not a lot of people pursuing, you heard the terms statutory benefits versus discretionary benefits. In my world, discretionary benefits is where unique benefits flow, but they require votes. They require councils to say, yes, we approve your plan. And in some cases, I felt like it seemed like people were not using a very aggressive incentive posture. But again, that kind of goes back to corporate goals. Maybe external affairs folks don't want to get into that stuff and so forth. And so really, what is the holdup? Well, these are some other critical findings, coming out of the interviews. It's really about cost justification. I mean, again, probably doesn't come as a big shock to everybody, but, if it's 13-cent power and grid energy is 6 cents, and, it's going to be hard to get corporate leadership to buy off on that situation unless there's another goal afoot. And then maybe there's some trends out there that I got from a secondary research that maybe alternative methods of cost justification, may be emerging. I think there were some earlier presentations we were talking about earlier about that may actually hint to like life cycle, but that's not what people that told me they're doing. It's ROI analysis on a time frame and so forth. But I think before we go on to the committee recommendations, I think we've covered these pretty quickly because I want to allow enough time for us to talk about the recommendations that emerge from this process. I guess I turn it over to the panel at this point, and do any of you all have any comments to illuminate on some of those findings and reactions to that?
I mean, I can speak to eBay's findings and how we've lived through this, and Dean and Mike Lewis, my boss up here, have helped driven some of the criteria in this, but our investment in the fuel cells in Utah was definitely exploration in unknown territory. We had to work with the local senator to get legislation so that we can enable a renewable option, which then eventually led to the fuel cell, and making sure that also was justified from a total cost of ownership or a long-term benefit to eBay. Our Utah facility is our most carbon-intensive location. It's something like 94% or higher coal-based. And we also looked at the risk of the utility, and that they were going to have to refresh coal plants in that area as well. So taking a longer view at it gave us better perspective as to what kind of investment we could make in that location. And definitely we're challenging the status quo. On-site generation is new to us. We're just getting our first fuel cells landed in the location now, and we'll be sure to tell the world how they're going to work. But in addition to that, we're also looking at what other ways can we source our centers. Utah's just one of them, from a renewable option. What are our options out there? How can we talk? In my mind, I think of the IT facilities gap, where within your organization, the two groups may not talk to each other, and they may not understand the power and demands that go into a data center. And then at a macro level, you kind of have data center demands working with utilities, and we may be a big player, we may be a small player in that environment. And how do we incentivize our utility partners to work with us to give us options that really lead to corporate sustainability and play into a larger perspective for any company? So yeah, some of my perspectives on it.
Yeah, and I think as we went through that, I mean, the whole concept of is it a carbon-free transaction? Is kind of as an aspirational goal, and so
definitely aspirational goal.
And I think that kind of speaks back to this whole the environmental goals of an organization can vary widely. An organization, as I found it, folks that their data center is the core of their business plan approach these topics differently than, say, for instance, folks that are supporting a bigger business unit like a big bank, where their data center is the tail rather than the dog, because their profits are made in transacting trades and so forth. And it probably, like I say, then it probably comes as no big surprise to you folks in the audience. But that's the challenge of trying to come up with kind of a unified approach on a sustainable site selection. Anybody else, any further comments?
I do. Yesterday morning, Christophe Garnier from Schneider had a breakout session early in the morning. And his topic was life cycle cost, but I found it really appropriate to our topic as well, because he was taking the position that the proper way to evaluate sustainable techniques and sustainable materials in a data center is to look at his total life cost, not just in terms of the TCO, which we like to use, which typically is for the life of the data center, maybe 10 years if it's a lease, or maybe 20 years if it's enterprise and owned. But his position was we need to take a look what happens after the useful life of the data center is over. How do we dispose of? Is it salvaged? Can we recycle the components? And one of the things he brought up, which we had never really considered before, is if we have a solar farm of 5 acres of PV panels, what do we do in 20 years if they are no longer cost effective? How do we recycle the thin films which are made with gallium and arsenic? I mean, they're toxic chemicals. So we should be evaluating really sustainability in terms of the total life cycle of materials used to build data centers. So it was very enlightening for me because we really hadn't talked about that for, we're maybe a little short-sighted, but I think it really makes us think about this topic, and structural steel or copper wiring or aluminum window framing is probably the most renewable, sustainable building material because we melt them down and refabricate them into new materials in a sense that, you could almost make the position like water, there's a finite amount in the world. Well, same with steel and copper, we just keep reusing it. But I think it's a very interesting point that we ought to think about incorporating into some of the objectives at some point.
Sure.
I think I'll comment too. I mean, just an emphasis on something. So one of the things that comes out of this is, number one, that the paper we did represents a domestic U.S. view, although the application is an international position. And I think what we end up coming back to is this, is that locations or economic development groups in their regions have an opportunity to offer incentive opportunities through taxation and the other factors that we normally see. But they also have the opportunity to maybe inch their meter of sustainability 1 inch to the right or 1 tick to the right if they have the ability to offer up environments where we can see a benefit of TCO that makes itself sustainable in its opportunity. And I'll point this out. Most organizations, in fact, there may be some folks in here that are part of their corporate citizenship and sustainability group, they're not motivated towards purchasing offsets because it has the tendency to look like you're greenwashing, right? On the other hand, we, in the data center environments, a lot of us have been doing optimization and efficiency programs for a while now. And so there's not a lot we can do on the right side of the decimal anymore. So where does that leave us? We're on the left side of the decimal trying to figure out how to improve the efficiency of the IT equipment. Or we're trying to find some sort of way of doing sustainable energy production either locally or just off-site. And those situations, a lot of the TCOs for the just off-site production or on-site production really never meet the requirements of the business. And so you end up sort of stuck that once you've done an optimization on your data center, you have no place to go at that point. And how do you get, more sustainable than you are? And that's sort of the place that most data center owner-operators are in today. It doesn't matter where you're at. And so the challenge there comes back to how do we work together and how do we make awareness that this exists and that the situation is what it is. There are companies like eBay who have made some significant decisions in their business plan and how they're going to do business and how they had those environments that usually, whether it's eBay or IBM or other companies who have made those big announced investments that had a sustainable positive result. It was very selective on the location. It was a very opportunistic situation, and they had a climate that supported that environment, allowing them to do that kind of a sustainable project. But the majority of the domestic U.S. and other locations are really challenged to find this way to get past sort of the loggerhead that we're at, where we can't get through, get through with new sustainable opportunities through the TCO models. We've optimized everything we can, and now we're stuck with buying offset credits, which our public groups would not want us to do in general. So,
right. Well, that's a good transition because on the working committee recommendations, I mean that's really that's kind of an underpinning of okay. Now what can we do? I mean, this is the state of the industry. This is a good representation. It's not an exhaustive representation of everybody's position, but it's a good representation of the industry. And so here's the recommendations that we've proposed here. Build a repository of public information and resources. And we'll drill down on these in more detail. Develop an indexing and benchmarking criteria. We've actually got an exemplary proposal on that. The one that everybody talked about that I ran by everybody is a GIS-enabled database with mapping outputs. And that represents a lot of work, would be valuable. Potentially, at least if it could be in an aggregate basis to steer you to the right regions consistent with where you want to be, if it's about carbon or other things. And then publish best practices, support sustainable sites, and empower state economic development offices. So to drill down, repository of information, we may dispose of this fairly quickly because, you know, this is the easy low-hanging fruit. In some ways, our white paper will represent a good start of that because some of the secondary research that I had my staff do, I mean, you know, we've footnoted the NREL maps. We're going to have endnotes with a number of publications out there by KPMG and McKinsey and Ernst & Young about global and corporate sustainability issues. And it may not be helpful to you, it might be helpful to you, you know, but going through the process of creating a repository of this information that somebody mentioned yesterday on I think about maybe something in the nature of it wouldn't be a wiki site, but something like that, where it's an interactive type of situation where consolidated summary of resources that you can access publicly, not proprietary, but public stuff if you don't already know about it, that gets you started down the right path. And also maybe a consolidated summary of the tax incentives out there to offset sustainability measures, whether that be water efficiency measures or it be state tax credits and refund programs for installation of solar units. There's some public resources out there that are very good on that stuff, and some states are very lucrative. I see a lot of that in my practice. Then indexing criteria. This is something that was mentioned, but we've provided, as Eddie and Dean and I edited the paper, we came up with a proposal here as an example, you know, whether it gets embraced or not. Part of what we agreed that this whole process we're going through with this white paper may be somewhat of a beginning of dialogue/debate. And this really, the example that we've come up here to propose as for consideration is to really focus on the carbon intensity issue, both from a current and future standpoint. I mean, if you go back to a sustainable site is one that's going to endure over time. And the static set of circumstances that are there today, in the case of Utah, 95% coal-fired energy source from the grid energy, that's what you got. And prior to changing the law in Utah, which I think you all did, that's what you're going to have, because it was illegal to construct on-site renewable facilities without it being, you'd be construed a public utility, and so a lot of policy and regulatory limitations are going to stop that. Coming up with this whole notion of comparing current to future carbon intensity potential and coming up with an elasticity factor that could give you an objective rating to at least try to address some of those issues and give you an idea, if you're in a particular region, your ability to adapt and account for those events that are inevitably going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years relative to carbon may be helpful. And like I say, we see this as more of a starting dialogue and, like I say, / debate over this issue as opposed to answering it. That's one of the beauty of writing a white paper. We're raising more questions than answers. Then GNS-enabled database. I mean, everybody I talked to said that would be great if you could do it. And the question is how much detail, how much drill down, you know, and it's all about the inputs and it's all about the user interface. Of course, Green Grid's no stranger to this stuff with the enabled database for free cooling.
The PUE map, Mark's map.
Yeah, so I mean, this would just be an extension of that. The question is, we'd have to come up with a process to figure out what do you want to actually map out? What kind of filter do you want to create? Because this isn't intended to replace consultants. It's to just help you on a desktop perspective to get you to the right area and start thinking in a more sustainable fashion. Best practices. Develop a body of information to proactively inform government policymakers. This came out a lot, that, you know, a lot of time your policymakers, I recently, in doing some legislative work in a state here, I gave a speech, and the first thing I started out on in educating this group of elected officials, number one, it's not a call center, it's a data center. And the difference between a call center and a data center is called a decimal point, right? Move the decimal point to the right. And those kind of buzzwords, I mean, it sounds funny, but it works, right? It's worked to kind of break it down easy like that. Also, when you're talking to, literally, in a community I'm working in, the chief elected official is a cattle rancher, big cattle rancher, so a very successful individual. But when I start talking about a 6 megawatt data center, you know, since he's a cattle rancher, I kind of use the saying, have you ever seen a cow looking at a new gate? You know, that's what you get. Megawatts, what are you talking about? A 10 megawatt facility, what is that? Well, it's it's a big facility, But you got to translate things and educate the policymakers to understand this new 21st century industry, right? Develop model terms for leases. This came out of one of the interviews that, when you do go down that continuum of control and you get away from a freestanding enterprise facility where you control everything and you build it from ground up and you put a big fence around it and nobody can even take pictures of it, and you're going to a colocation facility. There was a suggestion maybe could be some model terms here to maybe balance the risk of PUE, with your colocation landlord, or balance some of your sustainability goals in your lease term and work on some maybe through a forum in that regard. And then establish an economic development working committee again, kind of back to inform government policymakers, focus on concerns in the market. If the CEF metric were adopted, to focus on those areas to allow more development. I know, Eddie, you've had some thoughts on some of these best practices. Do you have any further comments on that?
No, I think the only thing I would say is that already there's, just in the dialogue over the last 2 days, there's Green Grid members who have said, we want to participate and get into the working committees, or we want to offer up some of our tools to help to do the JIS project. So I think that there's momentum that's already in place. Obviously, this white paper will do nothing and go nowhere if the general population of the Green Grid or its constituents don't participate in it. So at the end of the day, these recommendations are intended to empower all of us to do better sustainable practice inside of our industry. And it's not unlike much the manufacturing industry several years ago, and I know I say that a lot, but I just see this as the opportunity to kick these things off and to avoid these potential collisions that we might have,
right,
as opposed to react to those issues whenever they come. So.
Right. And then the final category of recommendation is empower state economic development offices, and this really goes to the renewable energy. And this was really important to one particular member, talking about informing economic development offices to enable renewable energy choices in their regions. I mean, I'm doing a lot of solar financing work right now in my law practice, and you go from state to state, and it's all different. I mean, in some cases, you can't even develop a 5 kW system as a private party to power your own house. It's illegal, and informing and educating to create that we're not going to take over big utility status. All we're going to do is, put 5 megawatts of whatever renewable energy resource you want to draw upon to supplement your energy requirements. Again, dialing down the carbon exposure to manage your carbon intensity at your site without having to go out and purchase RECs and do offset strategies and all of that. It's all about defining your goals. And this is kind of a specific recommendation. It really kind of flows from this whole idea of maybe an economic development and a policy forum. And we would have subheadings of goals on that. And but with that said, unless there's any other comments from the panelists, what's that?
I should offer.
Yeah, I was going to say, if there's any questions, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes here, and see if there's any questions from the crowd. Yes.
Henry wants a microphone.
Yeah, too far away for me to strangle you. No, one question is that although it's a great piece of work that you guys have done, one of the things that was curiously missing in some of the considerations was more on the data side in terms of data security and availability. One of the issues that came about in some of the cloud discussions that I've had with some of the people considering cloud was that some of the early adopters ran into problems of not being able to access their data. It was either dropped or missing. And then the question came up about liability. Where is that liability going to go through? And unfortunately, it was to the user who had no control over whether or not the data was going to be securely locked away and so forth. As we know, in order to go ahead and secure a lot of this information per se and so forth, it costs energy. It costs a footprint. And there are enough laws and regulations on the user of these facilities, these IT based companies and so forth to maintain that level of security. So I was a little bit surprised that that was not a factor, at least, in terms of what you have to consider as part of your sort of liability, sustainability requirements for the data center, especially as you move into the cloud.
I'll take this one, and then Jeremy, maybe you too. But. Sure. So specifically, I mean, a great concern about that is, for example, the impassable borders of information across, international locations, for example. And so there's legal and regulatory limitations that prevent that. And while, well, first of all, I'd say in the survey, that never came up. And there is an open architecture in the survey construct that allowed us to basically to comment on other things that would apply itself, like regulatory limitations and things like that. I think what happened is where there's those regulatory limitations, most of those that were interviewed have already established data center presence in those locations in order to be compliant. But I'd also say that I think there's value in applying what we do know in a database of regulatory limitations and how that might influence the decisions about narrowing what and where you might construct or where you might co-locate just based upon those that legal information. How readily accessible that is and the changes are to those, I don't know, but certainly this is a data point or a metadata point that could be captured.
And I would add in, eBay's developing our own internal cloud, and so there's a lot of thinking about what's going on in that regard, and how would we interoperate with other clouds. And data security is certainly top of mind, and a lot of that, because all the aspects that you mentioned, true. But I also think from a sustainability and choice selection, right? You have to understand those risks and mitigate them. So there could be a future by which maybe there's a colo provider providing a cloud solution that does have a secure and more sustainable option that you could move your data to, right? So at time of purchase, at time of site selection, whether you're choosing a cloud or a new facility that you're trying to own, real important to understand what you're doing with those investments and how you can be mobile with them in the future, right? That's where it's going to go. You're going to be able to make that decision based off a service. I'm going to move, my front-end platform to a different location because it's more sustainable there. Maybe I'll move it dynamically, right? I love to think about the future, and hopefully we have a future that looks like that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So the economic development councils or groups, whether it's in so the economic development councils, I think that's a really good area to explore. By the way, I did send you guys say I'll help you out on the task force. So yeah, now that's gone public, so I'm really in trouble.
Yeah, you're roped.
I'm on the hook. But so I think it's an area that's interesting. So in North America, for example, we've got a lot of pulp and paper mills that have been shut down, clothing, textile facilities that are going away, et cetera. And yeah, are they ideal sites for Tier 4 facilities, financials? Yeah, maybe not. But I think as you look down using a model that says, okay, what level of facility you need to buy, what's the business purpose? Maybe it's a cloud facility, where some of those issues are less of a concern, or maybe it's I hate to say, it's a search site. There we go. Or a social media site. So you are going to fail over to another one anyway. So I think having that discussion with some of these economic development councils, saying, you know what, you got this old retail facility, this mall that's being shut down, or you got this base that's being closed, or whatever. Let's talk. Maybe we can position that, as a viable site for a data center. It's going to need a lot of rework, but might be we could be a good tenant in that space.
Well, and to that point, I think that one of the biggest hurdles in trying to educate economic development professionals about there are some states that get it and they're going gangbusters, and there's some states and regions that don't. And the stumbling block almost to a jurisdiction is job creation. How many jobs you create? Well,
20.
Depends. It depends.
20, I heard that.
Yeah, 15, 20, 25. Well, that doesn't even meet our threshold. But you don't understand. This is the infrastructure upon which all business operates in the 21st century. And you're either going to be a digital hub in your community, or you're going to wish you were. And we've seen some anecdotal data that would be good to educate economic development professionals, like in the Phoenix area, where they've got big data center cluster, and they've got big jobs that follow on behind. Now anecdotally, that's kind of anecdotal, right? It's not. There's no quoting nexus on that. But those are the type of things that need to be vetted and then pushed out to the local jurisdictions to understand that they really do want these folks and why they want them, right? Any other questions? We got a couple more minutes here. Hate to squander them. Yes.
So was any thought put into the model about different inflection points that have happened or could happen, carbon pricing type of situations, the change in pricing for natural gas now as opposed to coal, et cetera, and the driving factors for where that puts us on the sustainability spectrum? And does it make sense to, we had a nice discussion about off-gassing methane. It makes a lot more sense to burn this stuff and turn it into carbon dioxide than it does to release it into the atmosphere, because it has ozone depletion factors and much higher greenhouse gas emission factors. So, even though some people think, oh, burning it, that's terrible, but it's actually useful and can go back into the cycle. So was any predictive stuff put in here about what if scenario planning?
No technical predictive tool, but I think that's the recommendation, is that we need to come up with a means by which to understand how to react to those inevitable circumstances. I mean, this has been a big topic for us, so we kind of glossed over some of the things you're talking about, which is the regulatory trend would suggest, and I don't know that I'm not going to try to make a prediction here, but it would not surprise me if we don't see some kind of a monetization of carbon in North America. I mean, they do it in other countries, it'd be a tax, a cap and trade tax. Our current presidential administration was very big on that, and as was the Democratic Congress back in 2009, and that was the last big run when the federal government tried to do that. Is it fair to say that next year it's going to be the big debate? I don't know that. I don't think anybody else knows that. But is it fair to say in the next 15 years that there could be an event, let's call it a carbon event, is going to happen? Probably, maybe, And if it does, then I think that's what this whole exercise we've tried to undertake is, how do you create a site selection that puts you in the best possible position to react to that in a way that doesn't paralyze you?
I mean, if you've made the choice to go to a site with 3 cents a kilowatt hour or 4 cents a kilowatt hour and they're 95% coal generated, then you can pretty well predict that if any kind of a tax is set up on carbon, your cost and TCO of operation may not meet its original goal.
Right. And if you have the regulatory limitation that was, the hurdle they fall through in Utah, I mean, you're just stuck. I mean, what are you going to do? You're just going to burn coal-fired energy.
Never mind, that's what I was going to ask.
Ah.
But the one thing that I remember seeing from your slides up there is you talked about a future carbon factor or future carbon.
Yeah.
So is that what the idea of that was? Is the likelihood that the site you're in is going to be affected by future carbon legislation?
Yeah.
Any idea of how to calculate that, or what?
So think about risk, right? If you think about risk associated with the predominant opportunity for earthquake or predominant opportunity for tornado or something like that, that's really what the future carbon index, or the intensity target was supposed to represent, is that it's an equal or similar risk when it comes to financials.
In probably a real rough scale, right? Like
Yes.
you have
Right.
most of your hydro now, or mostly carbon now, and we know of plans or not plans.
I mean, there's a lot of work to go in to figure that out. So, like I say, we get the fun job of just expounding some ideas, and then the hard work comes in to try to get it done. But, in a very big picture, it would occur to me that that's going to be a combination of regulatory framework analysis coupled with resource analysis that's untapped. And so you have an environment, maybe it's in the wind corridor in Kansas, I'm from Kansas City, so I'm familiar with Kansas. And so they got lots of wind energy potential that's untapped there. So that grid, that regional transmission area could trend towards green energy, so long as the impediments are solved to deliver the green energy to your data center. Well, transmission grid. That's the big impediment for Western Kansas, is you can get all the energy out there you want to, as long as you want to use it out in Dodge City. But if you want to use it in Overland Park, over in Kansas City side, that may not be possible. So it'd be a very complex calculation. So to your point, it'd have to be kind of rough in scale, or it could be very precise, but that's a matter of resources to solve for the problem.
It's probably more qualitative.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I personally thank you all for coming out. Like I say, staying in the last session. I thank everybody at the Green Grid for letting me have a chance to serve in this capacity. This has been a really worthwhile experience for myself, and I know the other panelists and the other work committee members have all echoed that to me as well. So, and thanks for the questions. John.